Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hi everyone. Very happy to see you through this online learning. I believe that some of you already at home, Mudik, and some might be remain in Jogja. I'm at home as well. During this COVID-19 outbreak, all of us have a difficult time. But I believe that we can get through this difficult time, and the way to do that is to stay at home as much as possible, di rumah aja, and try to limit your outdoor activities. In this session, we will discuss about the rise of China as a major global power, especially in terms of its economic dominance and expansion. The rise of China is an inevitable discussion topic because giving its recent enormous impact and influence across the globe. For example, in terms of its trade, manufacturing industry, investment, and then technological development, and not to mention about the military forces. Therefore, it's almost impossible to exclude China or not to mention China to every discussion in international studies. There are a couple of things that we will discuss in this session, especially to elaborate three main issues. The first, the rise of China's economy, and especially to look at the indicators. And the second, what's going on in China, especially in domestic politics. So we will look at the changes, what happened in the domestic politics. These changes is very important to look why and how the transformation of economy happened. And then the third, the impact of such economic transformation towards geoeconomic and geopolitics of East Asia specifically, and in the Asia Pacific in general. So first, let's try to look at the economic transformation and what indicators have been shown to us as a sign of such a transformation. There are many examples if we look at that might illustrate China's economic transformation, economic rise in recent years, especially its transformation into a global economic power, where most countries nowadays very dependent on China. Many aspects of China's economy have been influencing the world economy. At least we can look into three indicators that shows very important how China's rise in terms of economy. The first is China's impressive economic growth in terms of GDP since the last two decades. This sort of growth has started after the Asian financial crisis in 1997 and 1998. Since then, China has successfully maintained the growth above 6%. In 1996, for example, before the crisis, China's economy above around 6.3%, and then lower than that when the crisis. But in 2000, the economy rose to about 8.3%, and then rose to above 10%, which is almost 11% in 2005, and then rose to the peak of its number, to an impressive number, to about 15% in 2007 and 2008. That's right before the global economic crisis, which struck many countries in the North America, because the crisis was happened in the US. Since the global crisis, economy of China down to 6.1% because the deep engagement and involvement and integration of the China's economy with the US economy. But after that, China's economy continued to grow to 12% and then getting slow and lower to 7. And then last year, China's economy only rose to 6.2%. It seems lower number, but if you look at the data globally, that 6.2% still above all countries in the world, even the biggest economy that dominated the world economy for a couple of decades, which is the US. The US in 2019, its GDP only rose to around 3%. If we compare to Indonesia, Indonesia only rose to 5.2%. So China's economic growth has been very impressive for the last 2 decades. That's why this sort of growth has led to the transformation of China into the biggest economy in the world. Now, China, literally the biggest economy in terms of GDP in the world, outnumbered the US in the second position. But the projection for the next 2 decades, which is in 2030, China will continue its dominance into the largest economy with the number, the projection would be 64.2 trillion US dollar. The second biggest economy in that period of time will be India for 46 trillion US dollar, and the US will be in the third with 31 trillion US dollar. If you compare the number, China's economy as twice as much as the US, which means China's economy much bigger compared to the US. So this sort of economic growth in terms of GDP has shown clearly how China has become the major economic power in the world. So the second indicator will be the China's trade with the US, which has experienced enormous surplus also since the last 2 decades. So this has been going on for years and years. So it is understandable when Donald Trump took power in 2013, if I'm not mistaken, that he addressed these issues as one of the reasons why the US economy has been slowing down. But actually, this has been going on for years because of the close relationship between the US and China in terms of economic exchange. So in 2008, when Donald Trump announced the trade war campaign with the China economy, the export of the US economy to China, 120 billion US dollar, but the China export to the US, in other words, the US import from China, the number was 539 billion US dollars. That's a huge difference. So the surplus that gain benefits by China's government, around 419 billion US dollar. And this number much increased from the previous year in 2018, which was 375 trillion US dollar. So this sort of surplus in terms of trade has a sign clearly that how China has dominated the trade world in the last 2 decades. The third indicators is the successful story of China in providing an alternative of a global financial assistance to the rest of the world. As we know, for many years, the US has dominated in providing the funding to what the so-called the Washington Consensus through two influential institutions, IMF and the World Bank. So, for a number of years, many countries in the world has experienced uh, uh, dependence to the funding from these two institutions. But since 2016, China has provided an alternative by the establishment of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that allow many countries to access investment assistance and many other things. But importantly, it allows China to expand its economic influence through an international investment aid and debt. That's why these three indicators have clearly shows us how China has become a very dominant economic player in the world. So now let's see how we understand what has been going on in this transformation of economy. So actually, what has influenced China's transformation was actually the changes in the domestic politics of this country, especially the decline of a communist and Marxist ideology. We know very well that China is a communist country, which influenced very much by the ideology of Marxism. Uh, although we understand that China is a communist political system which represented by the single party of a Communist Party of China, but as an ideology, communism and Marxism has been decreased very significantly in influencing the policy. Such decrease has become the reason why China increased very much in terms of economic growth. There are a number of examples or indicators. There are four at least we can discuss. The first, the rise of nationalism in China that shaped the government policy. We see that the policy has not been influenced very much by the ideology of Marxism and socialism, but instead of a nationalism. The sentiment of China as a great power, sentiments of China should dominate the economy and the global politics. That's the sentiment of nationalism. The second that shows the decrease of this communist ideology is the China's government capitalist approach for many years. It's also known as the socialist market economy and socialism with Chinese characteristic. This sort of different approach by the government has started in the late 1970s when Deng Xiaoping led the country in many policies until today when Xi Jinping took power in 2013. There are two examples I can give you. The first, the policy of privatization since 1990s, where many state-owned companies sold by the government because they're not profitable and many debt. So in order to make it profitable, they sold to the private sectors. The second, China officially joined WTO in 2001. This is a huge movement, a huge move from China, because this is clearly opposing the Marxist and communist ideology, because the World Trade Organization is a very obvious representation of capitalist global capitalist system. So China entering that organization in order to pursue a different approach of economy. The second indicators that shows the decline of communist and Marxism ideology in China is the changes in the top leaders' background. In the fourth and fifth generation of leaders, we see the dominance of technocrats rather than the social activists from a labor background. So this changes of leaders has influence to the little attention to the ideology and more to the national welfare and prosperity of the people in solving of the problem, especially poverty and the many uh, aspect of a social riots, and as well as a the lack of economic growth in many regions. So this is represented by two leaders, Hu Jintao, who lead the country for one decade from 2003 until 2013, and then Xi Jinping, who succeeded Hu Jintao. And the last is the number of the last indicator is the number of Chinese capitalist class continues to grow as China changed its policy into capitalist system. But interestingly is that this capitalist class happily cooperate with the Communist Party elite as long as its policies benefit the business sectors. So that's the indicators and the changes within domestic politics that influence the economic transformation. But what's the outcome? What's the influence and consequences of this sort of transformation and the rise of China? We can see into different areas. The first, it influenced the economic policy in domestic, and the second is it changed the political policy at home, and the third, it changed and influenced the region. The first, China, after continuing with sort of economic transformation, China seized the opportunity to adopt more aggressive in terms of economic expansion. There are two examples. The first, the establishment of Belt and Road Initiative in 2013 under the presidency of Xi Jinping. This policy provides enormous funding to many countries in the world who can access many investment loan, especially in the infrastructure sector. But importantly, it allows China to expand its economy and its influence in the region. The second example is the diversification of business that carried out by China's government. China not only developed in manufacturing technology, but also enter into different areas such as the low energy product. And the second, this sort of transformation also influenced the political policy at home. China's model governance become more and more strong and giving little political freedom outside the Communist Party. There are two examples as well. The first, the restriction of Chinese government for social political activists, and the second, the strong policy approach that carried by Chinese government in dealing with Hong Kong and Taiwan. You might aware that in 2019, a couple of months rally in Hong Kong as well as in Taiwan in opposing the policy of the central government. And the last, influence towards the region. This is very important because what China's experienced in terms of a economic rise has contributed to the more tensions in the region. At least there are three examples. The first, the complexity of security and political issues. We are discussing about weapons, military forces, and then the approach that taken by China to South China Sea disputes, where China government has been very aggressive in dealing with the South China Sea. The second example is that China's promotion towards more regional economic integration in the region. The clearly initiative that shows this is the establishment, the initiative and the discussion of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP. This is ASEAN's initiative actually, but we know very well that how China has become the main sponsor of this cooperation. It's contribute to the more complicated relationship between China and Japan and China and India. We know that in 2019, India left the agreement because the calculation and afraid of the dominance of China. And the last example is the trade war between the US and China, and clearly this leads to the region to even more complicated situation, not only affected China but the whole region at all. So these are the discussion for today's session. So what next? Next, I encourage to all of you to read the reading material for this session, and after that, I ask you to take part in the quiz in answering a number of questions. I believe you will be doing very good in those questions, and thank you very much for listening, and take care. And one last word, stay at home, stay happy, and stay healthy. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bye bye.